The Mediterranean sun burned against the Phoenician coast, but Jezebel carried a different heat within her. When she stepped into the land of Israel, she did not look toward the palace as a home. She looked at the hills as a territory to be claimed. She brought the incense of Baal and the weight of foreign gods in her hands like a sovereign weapon. Within months, the silence of the Sumerian hills was broken, not by the sounds of the people, but by the rhythmic strike of hammers against stone. Massive altars rose from the earth, carved with symbols that had never touched this soil. She did not merely marry a king, she dismantled the covenant of the land. Every block of stone hauled into place was a declaration. Every temple that pierced the skyline was a fortress against the old faith. The air in the valleys grew heavy with the scent of strange offerings. She stood at the high vantage point of her new domain, watching the horizon change. The transformation was absolute, cold, and permanent. She turned away from the view, her purpose set, leaving the new stone monoliths to cast long, jagged shadows. The decree arrived as a cold, sharp blade. Jezebel demanded the silence of the prophets, and the kingdom obeyed. In the palace, she sat at a table heavy with wine and roasted meat, surrounded by the priests of her own gods, while the world outside began to bleed. Obadiah moved through the city, under the cover of a moonless night. He led 100 men into the damp, limestone caves, his breath shallow, his hands trembling as he carried bread and water into the dark. He left them there, listening to the drip of water against stone, praying for a morning that felt further away with every passing hour. Inside the palace, the air grew stagnant. The land began to wither. The dew vanished from the fields before the sun could even crest the hills. The soil cracked, spiderwebbing into deep, dry fissures that swallowed the roots of the grain. Then, the palace doors groaned open. Elijah walked in, his feet coated in the dust of a dying land, his eyes fixed on Ahab with a weight that stopped the king in his tracks. He did not bow. He did not wait for permission. "The heavens are shut," he declared, his voice cutting through the silence of the hall. The famine tightened its grip until the land was nothing but dust and brittle stalks. On the heights of Mount Carmel, the air hung heavy with the scent of dry brush and the metallic tang of blood. 450 prophets of Baal stood in the center of the clearing, their voices rising in a frantic, discordant chorus that clawed at the unmoving sky. They circled the altar, their feet kicking up clouds of fine, choking grit. When the silence of the heavens remained unbroken, they turned their blades upon themselves. They slashed their skin, letting the red heat of their own bodies stain the dry earth. They danced in a fevered, stumbling rhythm, their movements becoming erratic and jagged. They screamed until their throats were raw, their eyes wide and bloodshot, searching the horizon for a sign that never came. Hour after hour, the intensity of their desperation mounted, but the sky stayed a flat, mocking blue. One by one, they stumbled. Their legs gave way, their lungs burned, and they collapsed into the dirt, chests heaving in the suffocating heat. The ritual ended not with a miracle, but with the sound of heavy, ragged breathing and the absolute, crushing weight of a silent God. Elijah stood alone in the center of the clearing. He did not look at the broken men gasping in the dust. He walked to the ruins of the old altar, his movements slow and precise. He gathered 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and fitted them together until the structure stood solid against the horizon. He dug a trench around the base, the earth yielding to his spade with a dry, scraping sound. He laid the wood. He placed the sacrifice upon it. Then he turned to the onlookers. "Fill 4 jars with water," he commanded. They hesitated, then obeyed. The liquid splashed over the meat, soaking the wood and trickling down into the trench. "Do it again," he said. They poured a second time. The water pooled around the base, turning the dust into thick, dark mud. A third time, the final jars emptied, and the water overflowed the trench, saturating every inch of the offering. The scent of wet earth rose to meet the heat of the sun. Elijah stepped back. He knelt before the sodden pile, his hands resting on his knees. The crowd pressed in, their breathing shallow, their eyes fixed on the dripping stones. The wind died completely. The silence was absolute. Elijah spoke a single, low prayer. The air did not just shift, it tore open. A pillar of white-hot light plummeted from the zenith, striking the altar with the force of a falling star. The sound was a deafening, sustained roar that vibrated through the very bedrock of Mount Carmel. The fire did not merely burn, it vaporized. The meat vanished in a flash of searing heat. The wood turned to ash in a heartbeat. The stones themselves cracked and split, glowing cherry red as the water in the trench hissed and boiled away into a thick, suffocating cloud of steam. The heat wave blasted outward, forcing the onlookers to shield their faces. They did not stand. They fell, knees hitting the hard earth, faces pressed into the dust in primal terror. When the light faded, only scorched rock remained. The news traveled fast, reaching the palace. Jezebel stood in her chambers, the messenger trembling before her. She snatched the parchment from his hands, her knuckles turning white. Ahab sat in the palace, his face turned toward the wall. He refused food, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. He wanted the vineyard of Naboth, but the man would not sell. Jezebel entered the room, her footsteps steady on the stone floor. She stopped before him, her gaze sharp. "Are you not the king of Israel?" she asked. She reached out and took the signet ring from his finger. She did not wait for his answer. She sat at the table, dipped the quill, and wrote letters in the king's name. She sealed them with the ring, pressing the hot wax until it hardened into the royal mark. She sent the scrolls to the elders of the city. She hired 2 men to stand in the square and lie under oath. The plan moved with the precision of a trap. Naboth was dragged outside the city gates. The first stone struck his shoulder. Then came the others, a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the earth until he stopped moving. Jezebel returned to the palace. She walked to Ahab and placed the ring back into his palm. "Rise," she said. "The vineyard is yours." Quote, the ground began to tremble. A low, rhythmic thudding vibrated through the palace walls, growing into a roar of iron wheels against stone. Jehu was coming. The city gates groaned under the pressure of his advance. In her chambers, Jezebel did not run. She did not hide. She walked to her vanity, her movements deliberate and slow. She picked up the coal, her fingers steady as she traced the dark lines around her eyes. She arranged her hair, pinning it back with precision. She stood at the high window, looking down at the dust cloud rising from the chariot's path. Jehu pulled the horses to a halt, his face turned upward. He shouted to the attendants in the courtyard, "Who is on my side?" 2 men stepped forward, their shadows long against the palace base. Jehu raised his hand. "Throw her down." The command cut through the air. The men moved, their hands gripping the stone ledge. They shoved. Jezebel left the window, a blur of motion against the gray masonry. She hit the pavement with a sickening, heavy impact. The sound echoed off the city walls. Her blood splattered the stones, a dark, spreading stain. The pavement remained stained, a dark, jagged mark where the queen had fallen. The city grew silent, the air heavy with the scent of dust and iron. Then, the scavengers moved in. They came from the shadows of the alleyways, drawn by the stillness. They did not linger. They tore at the remains until the stone was scrubbed clean by their hunger. When the men returned to the site, tasked with the final duty of burial, they stopped in the middle of the street. They looked down at the ground. There was nothing left to carry. Only the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands remained, scattered across the gray stone. The rest had vanished, consumed by the earth and the wild things that roamed the city's edge. The prophecy had reached its absolute end. In the hills of Samaria, the stone temples began to crack. The altars of Baal, once towering and imposing, crumbled under the weight of the years. The wind carried the dust of the idols into the valleys, burying the names of the false gods beneath layers of silt and time. The throne room stood empty, the doors hanging from rusted hinges, the silence inside absolute. The kingdom moved on, the memory of the queen fading into the rhythm of the seasons. Yet, the story did not vanish. It lingered in the corners of the land. A sharp, cold whisper passed from generation to generation. Her name became a warning, a reminder of the power that challenged the heavens and found only dust in the end.